On the morning of September 10th, 1851, 54 men, women, and children vanished from the lush, rolling hills of the Sonoma Valley, leaving behind cold breakfasts, unmade beds, and a silence so profound it terrified the waking masters. It was not a migration, nor a scattering of runaways frightened by a sudden patrol. It was a precise, coordinated evacuation that defied every assumption the slave-holding establishment held about the people they claimed to own. In the span of a single moonless night, an entire workforce had evaporated from a region spanning nearly 60 miles, slipping through a net of patrols, armed overseers, and treacherous terrain without a single alarm being raised. The sheer mathematical improbability of the event staggered the authorities, who arrived at the Vance Ranch to find not a chaotic scene of flight, but an eerie, calculated emptiness that suggested a military operation rather than a desperate escape. The livestock remained fed in their pens. The fires in the kitchens were banked low as if for the night, but the quarters were stripped of human life with a ruthless efficiency that left the owners trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. Sheriff Alistair Crane rode into the main yard of the Vance estate just after dawn, responding to a frantic report from the night watchman, but he found no mob to disperse and no fugitives to chase. He found only Cornelius Vance, a transplanted plantation owner of immense wealth and cruelty, standing motionless on the porch of his great house, staring blankly at the rows of empty cabins that lined the edge of the vineyard. Vance was a man who prided himself on order, a discipline he had carried with him from the deep South to the gold-rich hills of California. Yet that morning, his knuckles were white as he gripped the railing, his face drained of its usual bluster. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no indications that 54 people had scrambled frantically into the darkness. Instead, there was only the haunting stillness of a stage set after the actors have departed, leaving the audience to wonder how the trick was performed. The scale of the disappearance paralyzed the local infrastructure, as news arrived by courier that the vanishings were not isolated to the Vance property, but extended to 5 neighboring ranches in a perfect radius. At the Hawthorne mine to the north, 32 laborers had abandoned their tools mid-shift, while at the Miller dairy farm to the south, the milkmaids had simply walked away into the fog, leaving the cattle lowing in the early morning light. The coordination required to synchronize such a departure across disparate locations and varied work schedules suggested a level of organization that the white establishment had long believed impossible for the enslaved population. It was a paralysis of the imagination as much as of the law. The authorities could not fathom a world where those they counted as property could execute a tactical withdrawal that would have impressed a general, forcing them to confront a terrifying new reality. Posses were hastily organized within hours, comprised of angry ranchers, hired gunmen, and off-duty militiamen who sought to reclaim their lost assets before the trail went cold, but the pursuit immediately descended into chaos. The trackers, usually adept at following broken branches and disturbed earth, found themselves baffled by a landscape that seemed to have swallowed the fugitives whole. Trails would appear, clearly marked for several miles, leading confidently toward a river crossing or a mountain pass, only to terminate abruptly at a rocky outcropping or a fast-flowing stream where the footprints simply ceased to exist. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed the escapees, or as if they had taken to the air like birds, leaving their pursuers to curse the empty sky and the useless skill of their hounds. At the Vance estate, a disturbing discovery was made in the main house that shifted the narrative from a simple theft of property to a chilling psychological defeat. Laid out on the heavy oak desk in Cornelius Vance's study was a single, crudely carved wooden spool wrapped in a scrap of blue fabric, a child's toy or perhaps a weaving tool, placed deliberately to catch the morning light. Beside it sat a letter, written in a handwriting that the sheriff recognized but could not immediately place, its script neat and unhurried, contradicting the urgency of the night's flight. The note did not beg for mercy or negotiation. It stated facts, listing the names of the departed and the moral justification for their departure, ending with a phrase that would echo through the valley for decades. The game is concluded. The atmosphere in the valley shifted from shock to a palpable, superstitious fear as the search parties returned empty-handed, their confidence shaken by an enemy they could not see or touch. Rumors began to circulate among the lower classes that the disappearances were supernatural, a divine intervention or a curse brought on by the hubris of men like Vance, who had brought the institution of slavery into a territory meant to be free. Even the most hardened overseers found themselves glancing over their shoulders, spooked by the silence of the fields, and the feeling that they were being watched by an intelligence far superior to the blunt force they usually employed. The power dynamic had been inverted in a single night. The masters were no longer the hunters, but the hunted, stalked by their own ignorance and the invisible threads of a conspiracy woven right under their noses. Historical records from the Sonoma County Courthouse indicate that on that specific morning, the value of human property in the region plummeted to near zero, not because the market had crashed, but because the security of the investment had been irrevocably shattered. Bills of sale, mortgages, and insurance policies became worthless paper in an instant as the legal apparatus struggled to define a crime that left no bodies and no broken locks. The colonial newspapers, such as the Sonoma Bulletin, initially decried the event as a colossal theft and a criminal conspiracy, offering rewards totaling thousands of dollars for information leading to the capture of the ringleaders. Yet, despite the astronomical sums offered, equivalent to a fortune in the gold rush economy, no one came forward. The silence of the remaining community was a testament to a loyalty that money could not buy, a wall of secrecy that stood impenetrable against the frantic inquiries of the law. Investigations later revealed that the escape had been months in the making, a conclusion drawn not from confessions, but from the absence of evidence. There were no stockpiled provisions found, no discarded maps, and no whispered rumors reported by the house servants who remained, claiming ignorance with a steadfast, almost practiced calm. It was this absence of residue that most haunted Sheriff Crane, who walked the empty slave quarters with a growing sense of unease, noting that even the personal effects of the vanished families had been removed with surgical precision. There were no tearful goodbyes left in the dust, no mementos dropped in haste. The cabins were swept clean, as if the inhabitants had simply dissolved into the morning mist, taking their history and their secrets with them. The paradox of the event lay in the contradiction between the perceived capability of the enslaved and the flawless execution of the plan. For years, the plantation aristocracy had propagated the myth of intellectual inferiority, a necessary lie to justify the brutality of the system. Yet the logistics of moving 54 people across hostile terrain without detection required a mind of singular brilliance. It required a knowledge of topography, an understanding of patrol schedules, and a network of safe passage that predated the escape by a significant margin. The authorities were forced to admit, however reluctantly, that they were dealing with a strategist of the highest order, a phantom commander who had turned the entire valley into a chessboard and checkmated the powerful men who thought themselves masters of the game. As the sun climbed high over the Sonoma Valley, casting long shadows across the vacant fields, Cornelius Vance remained on his porch, clutching the wooden spool left in his study, as if it were a poisonous snake. He was a man facing the ruin of his fortune and the exposure of his impotence, surrounded by neighbors who whispered that he had been outwitted by a seamstress. The silence of the valley was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with accusation and the terrifying realization that the invisible people who had cooked their meals and tended their vines had been watching, listening, and planning all along. The investigation had barely begun, but one fact was already etched in stone. The world had changed in the dark of night, and the masters were now the ones in the shadows. To understand how 54 people could evaporate into the morning mist, one must rewind the clock 18 months and step into the quiet, oppressive confines of the Vance household, where the architect of this disappearance hid in plain sight. Temperance Carter was known throughout the Sonoma Valley, not as a threat, but as a paradox of the system. A seamstress of extraordinary skill, whose demeanor was so thoroughly docile that even the most suspicious overseers dismissed her as harmless. She moved through the great house with her eyes cast downward, her voice barely a whisper, and her hands perpetually busy with mending the delicate fabrics of her mistress's gowns. To Cornelius Vance, she was the ideal investment, a woman past her prime, who seemed to have accepted her lot with a religious stoicism, possessing no fight left in her spirit. He frequently boasted to his guests that Temperance was the most trustworthy piece of property in the valley, a woman so broken by the life that she required no whipping to keep in line. It was a comfortable lie, he told himself, a reflection of his own arrogance, and it was the very blindness that would eventually cost him everything he had built in California. Her routine was the armor that protected her mind, a cycle of chores so predictable that it rendered her invisible to the white family she served. Every morning at dawn, she would rise in the small, damp room behind the kitchen to stoke the fires and prepare the water for the family's baths, her movements practiced and silent. She served meals with a blank expression, clearing plates and pouring refreshment, without ever seeming to listen to the conversations that swirled around the dining table. But Temperance was not merely serving. She was studying. Her downcast eyes were not fixed on the floor in submission, but were watching the patterns of movement, the placement of keys, and the subtle shifts in the master's mood. She memorized the sound of his boots on the stairs, the rustle of the newspaper he read in the evenings, and the specific rhythm of his breathing when he fell asleep in the parlor. She was a surveillance machine wrapped in the guise of a servant, and for 18 months she filed away every scrap of information like a seamstress sorting scraps of fabric for a future quilt. The mastery of her craft provided the perfect cover for the mapping of the valley, a task she undertook with the precision of a military cartographer. When sent to the nearby town of Sonoma to deliver finished garments or purchase thread and needles, she would walk slowly, appearing to any watcher as a tired woman enjoying a respite from her labors. In reality, she was counting paces, memorizing the turns in the road, and noting the locations where the dense vineyards offered concealment from the main thoroughfare. She observed the positions of the other ranches, marking the distances between them and the routes the patrols took when riding the perimeter. Her mind absorbed the landscape with a photographic intensity, transforming the rolling hills and river crossings into a mental grid. She knew which farms were owned by men who drank too heavily in the evenings, which neighbors were struggling financially and might be susceptible to bribery, and which paths led to the dense forests of the coastal range where trackers would struggle to find a trail. Her intelligence was not a recent acquisition, but a weapon forged in the fires of her past, a secret history that Cornelius Vance had never bothered to learn. Born on a failing tobacco plantation in Virginia, Temperance had been lucky enough to catch the eye of the master's youngest son, a scholarly young man who had been sent north for education and returned with radical ideas about liberty. In the dusty quiet of the attic, away from the whip and the fields, he had taught her to read and write, introducing her to the world of geography, history, and military strategy, through the books he smuggled into the slave quarters. He treated her not as property, but as a mind capable of reason, and in doing so, he ignited a spark that decades of brutality could not extinguish. When he was killed in a duel over political arguments, that education went underground, hidden behind a mask of civility that protected her from the suspicion of those who feared an educated slave. By the time she was sold and transported west to California during the gold rush, she possessed an intellect that rivaled the men who claimed to own her. The relocation to California had been a terrifying upheaval, a journey of months by ship and wagon that tore her from the only landscape she had ever known. Yet, even in the harrowing transit, Temperance had been gathering data. She noted the stars in the night sky, learning to navigate by the constellations when the wagon trains stopped on the open plains. She listened to the conversations of the drovers and the guides, learning about the topography of the new territory they were approaching, a place that was technically free soil, but was rapidly filling with men determined to drag the institution of slavery across the continent. She observed the rivers they crossed, the mountain passes they traversed, and the supply depots along the way, realizing that in this chaotic, lawless land, knowledge was the only currency that mattered. When they finally arrived in the lush, untamed Sonoma Valley, she knew she had arrived in a place of opportunity, where the chaos of the gold rush might just provide the cover she needed to change her fate. Settling into the rhythm of the Vance Ranch, Temperance began to construct a network of communication that relied not on written notes, which could be intercepted, but on the subtle language of the domestic sphere. She utilized the very tools of her trade, sewing patterns into quilts and clothing that appeared to be mere decoration, but actually conveyed directions and safe houses to those who knew how to read them. A specific knot in a garment delivered to a neighbor's house could signal a meeting time. A particular shade of blue thread used in a hem could warn of increased patrols. She was building a language of liberation right under the noses of the people who wore her creations, a silent code that turned the domestic labor she was forced to perform into an act of war. It required a patience that was agonizing to maintain, a stillness that felt like paralysis, but she knew that a premature move would result in nothing but a shallow grave in the vineyard. The other enslaved people on the ranch initially viewed her with the same suspicion they reserved for all house servants, assuming she was aligned with the master's interests due to her proximity to the family. Temperance worked slowly to dismantle this barrier, offering small kindnesses. A spare scrap of cloth for a bandage, a warning about a bad batch of cornmeal, or a shared moment of genuine human connection. She identified the strongest and most restless among the field hands, the ones whose eyes still held the fire of resistance, and she began to test them with coded questions. "Do you think the winter will be cold?" she might ask, but if she used a specific inflection, the question meant, "Are you ready to run?" It was a dangerous recruitment process, as a single betrayal would have meant immediate torture and death. But she moved with the caution of a spider spinning a web in a storm, connecting threads only when she was certain they would hold. Living in the main house placed her in a unique position to observe the psychological vulnerabilities of her oppressors, weaknesses that she catalogued with the detachment of a physician diagnosing an illness. She saw that Cornelius Vance was a man driven by a desperate need for validation, eager to prove that he could transplant the aristocratic lifestyle of the South onto the rough soil of the West. This insecurity made him blind to the humanity of those around him. He saw only reflections of his own success or failures. He underestimated her because he needed to believe in the narrative of the happy, simple servant. And she fed that need with performances of meekness that would have shamed the finest actresses of the stage. She laughed softly at his dull jokes, sighed in agreement with his complaints, and presented herself as a vessel devoid of ambition, all while sharpening the blade that would eventually sever his hold on her life. By the spring of 1851, the map in her mind was nearly complete, a lattice of trails and refuges that stretched from the vineyards of Sonoma to the chaotic streets of San Francisco. She had identified allies in the free black community to the south, and had memorized the schedules of the coastal steamers that could carry a fugitive north to Oregon or south to Mexico. She knew the locations of the Native American villages that might offer shelter, and the isolated mining camps where a person could disappear in exchange for hard labor. She was a general without an army, holding the plans for a fortress siege in her memory, waiting only for the moment to mobilize the forces she had quietly assembled. The structure of the operation was built on the foundation of her patience, a monument to the power of a mind that refused to be broken by the weight of chains. Yet, for all her preparation and strategic brilliance, Temperance was playing a long game that prioritized survival over immediate gratification, a strategy based on the cold calculation of probabilities. She knew that California was on the verge of statehood, a political shift that would officially outlaw slavery in the territory and potentially provide legal cover for those who escaped. Her plan had been to wait, to let the law catch up to her ambition, and to slip away quietly when the system was distracted by the transition. But the masters of the valley were growing restless, their greed outweighing their caution, and the rumors of impending territorial restrictions were making them dangerous. The delicate balance of power she had been navigating for 18 months was about to shift violently, threatening to shatter the mask she had worn so well, and forcing her hand in a way she had never anticipated. The stillness of her life was a loaded gun, and the trigger was about to be pulled by an event no amount of planning could have foreseen. The delicate patience Temperance had cultivated for 18 months shattered on a humid afternoon in late May, when a carriage driven by a stranger rolled into the courtyard of the Vance estate. The visitor was a man named Silas Gantry, a prospector-turned-labor contractor whose reputation for brutality in the northern mines preceded him. He was a man of rough edges and greedy eyes, looking to acquire strong workers for claims far removed from the civilizing influence of the coastal towns. Cornelius Vance greeted him on the veranda, with the hospitality reserved for potential business partners, and Temperance, standing invisibly behind a parlor curtain, felt the air in the room grow heavy with impending disaster. She watched Gantry's eyes scan the property, not with the appreciation of a guest, but with the calculating assessment of a buyer at a livestock auction, and she knew that whatever deal was being struck on that porch would bring nothing but suffering to the people she was trying to protect. The conversation drifted through the open windows, pieces of negotiation floating on the breeze, revealing the transactional nature of the lives at stake. Gantry needed workers for a hydraulic mining operation near the Trinity River, a rugged and isolated region where the law was a distant memory and the conditions were lethal. He offered a sum of $3,000 for 2 healthy laborers, a price that reflected the desperation of the labor shortage in the Northern Territories. Vance, usually a man who hoarded his assets, seemed hesitant to sell, yet the glint of gold dust Gantry produced from his pouch was a persuasive argument that eroded the master's reluctance. Temperance's hands tightened around the fabric of the curtain, her knuckles whitening as she realized that the fragile stability of the plantation was about to be fractured by a simple exchange of coin. It was when Gantry's gaze swept past the barns and settled on the small figure of Temperance's 8-year-old daughter, Clementine, that the true horror of the moment crystallized. Clementine was playing near the kitchen garden, a small girl with quick hands and a bright, observant gaze, far too young for the brutal labor of the mines. Yet Gantry saw not a child, but a commodity, a girl who could cook for the camp, haul water, and serve the needs of the men in ways that Temperance dared not let her mind fully articulate. "That one's got spirit," Gantry remarked, pointing a stained finger toward the garden. "Small, but wiry. I'll take her and the big field hand, Jupiter. 3,000 for the pair." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Temperance felt the floor beneath her tilt, the world she had carefully mapped and monitored, dissolving into a red haze of panic. Vance's hesitation was brief, a flicker of human conscience that was quickly extinguished by the weight of financial pragmatism. "The girl is the cook's daughter," Vance replied, his voice carrying the tone of a man discussing the weather. "But she is quick to learn. If you are set on her, the price stands." There was no discussion of Temperance's feelings, no acknowledgement of the mother's bond, or the cruelty of ripping a child from the only safety she had ever known. In the economy of the South, transplanted to California soil, these were not factors that weighed against the heavy allure of gold. The deal was struck with a handshake that sealed Clementine's fate, and Temperance watched from the shadows as the master she had fooled for so long proved exactly how little he understood about the woman he owned. The moments that followed were a blur of agonized restraint. Temperance was forced to serve refreshments to the men who were bargaining away her child's future, pouring lemonade into glasses with a hand that only trembled slightly, a testament to the iron control she exercised over her own body. Gantry leered at her, making a comment about how the mother might be useful in the camps as well, but Vance waved it off, claiming he could not spare his seamstress. Clementine, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had crept closer to her mother, tugging at the hem of her apron with small, dirty fingers. "Mamma, who is that man?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the instinctive fear that all vulnerable children learn too young. Temperance could not answer. To speak the truth would be to invite a beating that would leave her unable to protect anyone. So she simply stroked her daughter's hair, memorizing the feel of the curls, the scent of the soap, and the warmth of the small hand in hers. The separation came with a brutal swiftness that left no room for goodbyes. Gantry was a man who understood that the longer a transaction lingered, the more likely complications were to arise, and he was eager to get his new purchases on the road before nightfall. He tossed a canvas bag of coin to Vance, and in return, the overseer, a man named Pike, was ordered to fetch Jupiter from the fields and bring the child to the carriage. Clementine clung to Temperance, her small fingers digging into the rough fabric of the apron, a desperate anchor against the rising tide of terror. "Mamma, don't let them take me!" she cried, a sound that shattered the calm afternoon and seemed to hang in the air, accusing the sun, the sky, and the indifferent earth itself. It was a scream that Temperance would hear in her nightmares for years to come, a sound that marked the death of her patience and the birth of a new, colder resolve. Pike stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and pried the child loose with the efficiency of a man handling a stubborn calf. Temperance lunged forward, the mask of the docile servant finally cracking, her maternal instinct overriding years of calculated survival. "Please, Master Vance," she begged, her voice raw and unrecognizable. "Not her. She's just a baby. I'll work double. I'll pay you back. Just don't let him take her." It was the first time she had ever spoken out of turn, the first time she had dropped the shield of invisibility, and the shock on Vance's face was momentary. He looked at her, perhaps seeing her for the first time as a human being rather than a fixture of his household, but the transaction was done. The gold was already in his pocket, and in his world, a deal was a contract more binding than blood. "Get back to the kitchen, Temperance," he said coldly, turning his back on her despair. "You can have more children." The carriage ride away was a tableau of cruelty. Jupiter, a young man of 20 who had once dared to dream of running to Oregon, sat slumped in the back of the wagon, his spirit already broken by the sight of the child's tears. Clementine was lifted and tossed onto the rough wooden bench beside him, her wrists quickly bound with a rough rope to prevent her from jumping. Gantry cracked the whip, and the horses lurched forward, the wheels grinding over the dirt path that led away from the only home Clementine had ever known. Temperance ran alongside the carriage for a few desperate steps, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until Pike grabbed her by the shoulder and held her back with a force that bruised her arm. She watched the dust cloud rise in the distance, the silhouette of the wagon growing smaller and smaller until it vanished around the bend in the road, taking her heart with it. She stood in the yard for a long time after the dust had settled, the silence of the estate returning to mock her grief. The other enslaved people watched from a distance, their heads bowed in shared sorrow, but too fearful to approach, knowing that any sign of collective mourning would be met with suspicion and violence. Pike eventually released her, shoving her toward the house with a warning to calm down before the master sees you. But Temperance barely felt his hands. She walked back to the kitchen, not as the obedient seamstress who had entered it that morning, but as a woman transformed by fire. The tears on her face dried in the heat, leaving tracks of salt that felt like scars, and her eyes, which had been downcast for so long, now lifted to the horizon with a gaze that was sharp and unyielding. In her small room that night, Temperance sat on the edge of her cot, the darkness pressing in on her, and realized that the long game was over. The patient accumulation of knowledge, the slow mapping of the valley, and the careful networking. All of it had been predicated on the assumption that she could buy time. But time had just been sold for $3,000. She reached under the loose floorboard, where she kept her most precious possessions, a few stolen coins, a dried herb bundle, and a small, leather-bound journal she used to sketch the topographical maps she had memorized. She pulled out a needle she used for quilting, holding it up to the sliver of moonlight that pierced the gloom. It was a simple tool, but in her hands it was a weapon. She pricked her finger, watching a bead of dark blood well up, and made a silent vow. She would no longer wait for freedom to be granted by the stroke of a politician's pen. She would tear it from the hands of her oppressors. The pain in her chest was not a wound, but a forge, hammering her grief into a strategy of cold, unyielding steel. She thought of the quilt patterns she had sewn, the maps she had memorized, and the people who looked to her for guidance, and she knew that the time for preparation had ended. She would organize the escape, not for the distant promise of statehood, but for the immediate necessity of retrieval and survival. The network she had built would not just be a path to freedom. It would be a net cast wide enough to catch a falling star, a system designed to retrieve her daughter from the ends of the earth. Temperance lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind already racing ahead, calculating distances and risks. The mask was still in place, but behind it, the general had awakened, and she was preparing for war. 3 nights after the carriage bearing Clementine vanished into the northern dust, Temperance slipped away from the Vance estate under the cover of a heavy fog that clung to the valley floor like a shroud. She navigated the darkness with a precision that defied the disorienting mist, her feet finding the familiar deer trails that ran parallel to the main coach roads. Her destination was an abandoned cooperage on the banks of the Russian River, a rotting structure of timber and rusted iron hoops that had once served the beverage trade before the owner went bankrupt chasing gold. It was a place known to the disenfranchised of the valley as a rare blind spot in the overseer's patrols, a forgotten corner where the damp wood muffled sound, and the overgrown willows provided a curtain against prying eyes. Tonight, it would serve as the war room for a conspiracy that would shake the foundations of the California slave system. Inside the damp, cavernous space, the air smelled of wet earth and old beverage stains, a sharp contrast to the manicured parlors Temperance usually served. 19 figures emerged from the shadows as she entered, their faces illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through gaps in the roof. These were not the field hands who had resigned themselves to a life of toil, but the ones who had answered her coded calls, men and women who carried the scars of the whip and the burning desire for something more than survival. There was Silas, the blacksmith whose massive arms belied a gentle intellect, and Harriet, a laundress who could move through the white neighborhoods unnoticed. They gathered in a loose circle, their breath visible in the cold night air, waiting for the woman they knew only as a quiet seamstress to speak. Temperance stood before them, her posture straighter than it had ever been in the presence of white men, shedding the hunch of civility that had protected her for so long. She did not begin with pleasantries or expressions of sorrow. There was no time for the rituals of mourning when action was required. "The sale of my daughter was not an isolated act of cruelty," she began, her voice low but carrying the weight of iron. "It is a sign that the masters are growing desperate. They know the laws are changing, and they are liquidating their assets, our bodies, before we can claim the freedom the state promises. If we wait for California to join the Union, we will find ourselves sold south to Texas or the Carolinas before the ink is dry on the Constitution." The group shifted, a murmur of grim recognition passing through them. They had all sensed the rising anxiety in their masters, the hurried whispers, and the frequent visits from strange buyers. She reached into the satchel at her hip and withdrew a bundle of cloth scraps, not the fine silks of her daily work, but rough squares of burlap and muslin she had pieced together over months. Spreading them on the earthen floor, she revealed that these were not merely rags, but a map of the Sonoma Valley rendered in abstract geometry. "I have spent 18 months learning every road, every river crossing, and every hiding spot within 50 miles, she explained, pointing to a blue strip of fabric representing the Russian River and a jagged brown patch denoting the coastal mountains. "The masters see a quilt or a mended shirt. They see labor and utility. But we see the world as it truly is. We have been mapping our escape in plain sight." The revelation stunned the group. They leaned in, realizing that the seemingly innocent patterns Temperance had sewn into their clothing over the years were actually detailed intelligence briefings. "The old plan was to wait," Temperance continued, her finger tracing a path northward on the cloth map. "But waiting is a luxury we can no longer afford. We are going to leave, but not in ones and twos, to be hunted down by dogs and guns. We are going to leave all at once." She let the concept hang in the air, a bold and terrifying proposal that defied all conventional wisdom of escape. 54 of us, from 5 different ranches, on the same night, at the same hour. We will scatter in 10 different directions, flooding their pursuit capabilities. They cannot chase 10 trails with the men they have. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, as the conspirators processed the sheer audacity of the strategy. A young man named Moses, who worked the docks at the port, stepped forward, his face etched with skepticism. "That is madness, Temperance. 54 people moving at once. The noise alone would wake the dead. And the patrols, they will cut us down before we clear the valley." His fear was valid, echoing the practical concerns that nagged at every mind in the room. But Temperance met his gaze with a calm, steely resolve. "Noise is manageable if we are synchronized," she countered. "And the patrols are predictable. I know when they change shifts. I know which captains are lazy and which are drunk by midnight. We move during the shift change, using the fog and the moonless nights. We are not running blindly, Moses. We are executing a tactical withdrawal." She began to assign roles with the authority of a general deploying troops, transforming the gathering into a council of war. Silas was tasked with procuring tools that could serve as weapons: hoes, files, and heavy iron bars that could be hidden in the fields. Harriet was assigned to the critical job of gathering intelligence from the big houses, using her position in the laundry rooms to intercept letters and listen to the master's plans. Another woman, an older domestic named Sarah, was to act as the quartermaster, slowly siphoning dried meat, cornmeal, and blankets from the storehouses, in amounts too small to be noticed individually, but significant when pooled together. Each person was given a specific, isolated task, ensuring that no single individual knew the entire scope of the operation beyond Temperance herself, a security measure designed to protect the whole if one link was broken. "The key is coordination," Temperance stressed, holding up a small, carved wooden spool identical to the one she would later leave on Vance's desk. "We will communicate through these. A blue thread means go. A red thread means danger, abort. They will be left in designated hollow trees and loose fence posts. No spoken words, no written notes that can be found. If you see the signal, you move. If you don't, you stay and wait for the next window." It was a system that relied entirely on the discipline and literacy of the group, a gamble on the very humanity that the slave system denied they possessed. But as she looked around the circle, she saw not the dull eyes of property, but the sharp, calculating gazes of operatives ready to fight for their lives. The meeting lasted for hours, the details of the plan being dissected and refined in hushed tones. They discussed the routes, some heading north toward the Oregon Territory, others west toward the coast, and a few daring souls planning to hide in the dense forests of the coastal range. Temperance revealed the locations of hidden caches she had established: a hollow log near the river, filled with salt pork, a cave in the foothills stocked with stolen shoes. She laid out the timeline with mathematical precision, counting down the weeks until the date she had selected. A night in early September, when the harvest moon would be hidden by the predictable autumn fog. The scale of the preparation was immense, a logistical feat that would have challenged a military supply officer. Yet it was being orchestrated by a woman who had never been allowed to read a map in the open. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the cooperage roof, the meeting drew to a close. The air in the room had changed. The fear and skepticism of the early hours had been replaced by a grim determination and a flicker of hope. They were no longer a collection of isolated victims, but a unified force with a common objective. Temperance looked at each face in the semicircle, committing them to memory, the people whose lives now rested in her hands. "We have 7 months," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of the oath. "In 7 months, we vanish. Go back to your duties. Smile. Sing. Let them think they own you. But prepare your hearts and your feet for the night we take our freedom." The group dispersed as silently as they had arrived, melting back into the shadows of the valley to resume their masks of servitude. Temperance remained in the cooperage for a long moment, staring at the cloth map on the ground. She thought of Clementine, somewhere in the northern mines, and felt the cold fire of her purpose burn brighter. This was no longer just about escape. It was about creating a diversion so massive, a statement so bold, that the very earth would shake, eventually reaching the ears of her daughter and the man who thought he could buy a child's life. She rolled up the map, tucked it into her apron, and stepped out into the mist, ready to wage a war that the masters would never see coming. The weeks that followed the covert assembly in the cooperage were defined by a silent, grinding accumulation of resources that would have gone unnoticed by even the most vigilant observer. Temperance had orchestrated a campaign of micro-theft, so subtle that it effectively rendered the plantation's economy complicit in its own destruction. Every individual involved in the conspiracy was tasked with secreting away minute quantities of supplies, a handful of cornmeal tucked into a pocket, a single candle stub hidden in a shoe, or a few feet of sturdy rope coiled inside a hollowed-out log. Individually, these items were worthless, the kind of debris that might fall through the cracks of a busy household. But when aggregated at the secret caches Temperance had established in the surrounding woods, they transformed into the lifeblood of an exodus. She oversaw this logistical miracle with the precision of a quartermaster, knowing that 54 people fleeing into the wilderness would require not just courage, but calories, warmth, and tools. Silas, the blacksmith whose massive frame belied his delicate touch, became the armorer of the operation, turning the plantation's own tools into the instruments of its undoing. Working at his forge during the day, he would intentionally damage old horseshoes or worn-out axe heads, claiming they needed to be melted down and recast. In the privacy of the night, however, he would hammer the salvaged metal into crude but lethal knives and sharpened digging implements, hiding the weapons in the false bottom of a wagon that regularly transported produce to the port. He also fashioned heavy iron hooks that could be used to scale fences or create pulley systems for lowering supplies down ravines. The risk was enormous. The discovery of a single weapon would have meant immediate execution. But Silas worked with a steady rhythm, his hammer falling like a heartbeat of resistance against the silence of the slave quarters. Information, however, proved to be a far more valuable currency than iron, and Temperance's network of domestic workers excelled at gathering it. Harriet, the laundress, moved through the bedrooms of the elite like a ghost, her presence so routine that the white families often forgot she was in the room. She developed an ear for the nuances in their voices, learning to distinguish between a casual grievance and a serious plan. It was she who brought Temperance the critical intelligence that the territorial patrols were severely underfunded and that the sheriff, Alistair Crane, was currently embroiled in a land dispute that occupied most of his attention. This information allowed Temperance to identify a window of vulnerability in the valley's defenses, a specific night when the law's gaze would be averted, providing the cover necessary for a mass movement. Temperance knew that they could not survive the journey without outside assistance, and she spent weeks carefully identifying potential allies among the white population. She looked for the outliers, the people who did not fit the mold of the gold-hungry settlers or the southern aristocrats. Her search led her to Brother Nathaniel, a Quaker merchant who operated a small dry goods store on the outskirts of Sonoma. He was a man known for his quiet demeanor and his refusal to sell spirits, a stance that had alienated him from much of the rowdy mining population, but had earned him the respect of the local native tribes and the few free black families in the area. Temperance approached him under the guise of purchasing thread, lingering in the store until the other customers had departed, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The conversation was a dangerous dance of coded language and careful testing of loyalties. "The nights are getting colder, sir," Temperance said softly, her eyes fixed on a bolt of calico. "A body needs more than just thread to keep the chill out." Brother Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze sharp and assessing, and seemed to read the desperation hidden beneath her calm exterior. "Some threads," he replied, his voice barely a whisper, "can bind more than cloth. They can bind people together." In that moment, a fragile alliance was forged. He could not offer them sanctuary on his property. The risk was too great. But he agreed to provide 3 large sacks of dried beans and a map of the coastal trails that led to a sympathetic fishing village north of Bodega Bay. This alliance was a turning point for the operation, transforming it from an internal revolt into a networked escape. Brother Nathaniel also introduced Temperance to a shadowy figure known only as the Captain, a former sailor who operated a small schooner out of a hidden cove. For a price, part of the gold dust that Silas had managed to skim from the blacksmith's furnace repairs. The captain agreed to ferry a group of 8 escapees down the coast to San Francisco, bypassing the treacherous overland routes entirely. This maritime option was a logistical coup, offering a swift and relatively safe exit for the most vulnerable members of the party, including the elderly woman known as Aunt Sarah, whose feet were too swollen for a long march. As the weeks bled into summer, the strain of maintaining her double life began to manifest physically on Temperance. Her frame, always slight, became gaunt, and dark circles shadowed her eyes, betraying the sleepless nights spent calculating distances and contingencies. Yet, inside the kitchen of the Vance estate, her performance was flawless. She cooked elaborate meals for Cornelius Vance and his guests, smiling softly when he complained about the heat, while mentally cataloguing the supplies she had moved that day. She even managed to use the lavish garden parties to her advantage, convincing the master to let her take table linens to a special washerwoman in town. Another conspirator who used the opportunity to pass intelligence through the weave of the fabric. One of the most delicate operations involved the creation of forged freedom papers, a task that required a steady hand and a fearless heart. The forger was a young mixed-race man named Thomas, who had been taught calligraphy by his former master, a lawyer in the East. Thomas worked in a cramped cellar beneath a livery stable, replicating the official seals and signatures of territorial judges with alarming accuracy. Temperance provided him with the names and physical descriptions of the escapees, and he produced documents that claimed they were free persons of color from Oregon, legally entitled to travel and work. These papers were their shield against casual inspection, a fragile barrier between freedom and the auction block, and Thomas produced them with the understanding that a single spelling error could doom them all. By late August, the invisible infrastructure of the escape was nearly complete. The caches were stocked with enough dried meat, hardtack, and water gourds to sustain a large group for 5 days. The routes had been walked and re-walked by scouts who memorized every turn and obstacle. The signals, the red and blue threads, the placement of specific stones at crossroads, had been committed to memory. The conspiracy had grown to involve over 50 people, yet not a whisper of it had reached the ears of the overseers. It was a testament to the iron discipline and desperate hope that bound the community together, a silence louder than any shout. However, the delicate timing of the plan was threatened by the accelerating political climate. Rumors began to swirl that California's admission to the Union was imminent, a development that Temperance had hoped would provide a legal smokescreen for their departure. But with statehood came the looming specter of the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law that would compel all citizens to assist in the capture of runaways, even in free states. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Temperance realized that waiting for the legal protection of statehood might actually trap them in a tighter net of enforcement. She had to accelerate the timeline, moving the date of the escape forward by 2 weeks, compressing the final preparations into a frantic, breathless sprint. Temperance stood in her room one evening, looking at a crude calendar she had scratched onto the underside of a drawer. The new date was circled in charcoal, September 10th. It was less than 3 weeks away. The realization sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The massive machine she had built, this invisible railroad of cloth and silence, was about to be tested. She thought of Clementine, her daughter, somewhere in the distant north, and felt the weight of the chess pieces in her mind clicking into their final positions. The board was set, the moves were calculated, and the only thing left to do was to wait for the signal to break. As the calendar turned to September and the final immovable deadline loomed just days away, Temperance summoned the core conspirators to one last council of war. The location this time was not the relative safety of the abandoned cooperage, but a secluded hollow in the dense thicket bordering the western edge of the Vance vineyards, a choice driven by the paranoia of the final hour. The group that gathered in the damp darkness was tense, the air thick with the electricity of impending action. These were the lieutenants of an invisible army, and the weight of the lives they carried pressed heavily upon their shoulders. Silas, Harriet, Moses, and the others looked to Temperance, not just for instruction, but for the steel to see them through the terror of the next 72 hours. Temperance stood before them, her face a mask of calm resolve, though her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a drum signaling the charge. She unfurled a piece of cloth on the ground, not a map this time, but a schedule of movements that resembled the timetables of a railway more than the plans of an escape. "The night of September 10th, she whispered, her voice cutting through the rustling of the wind in the leaves. "We move at midnight, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. She assigned specific sectors of the valley to each leader, detailing who would cut the fences, who would silence the dogs, and who would lead the families with small children. The complexity of the coordination was staggering, a symphony of silent movement that required every single player to perform their part with absolute precision. A single missed cue, a single loud cry or stumbled foot could cascade into a disaster that would doom them all. The psychological warfare component of the plan was the most dangerous, and it fell to a small team led by Harriet. Their task was not to run immediately, but to stay behind for an hour after the main groups had departed, sowing chaos in their wake. Temperance had devised a campaign of phantom rumors to be planted in the saloons and taverns that very evening, whispers of a massive gold strike in the opposite direction of their escape routes, designed to lure away the more mercenary elements of the patrols. Furthermore, they were to stage minor accidents, a spilled lantern here, a broken wagon wheel there, that would occupy the attention of the night watchman. It was a game of misdirection, a sleight of hand performed on a grand scale, intended to make the masters look everywhere except where the actual exodus was occurring. Security protocols were tightened one final time, a grim necessity in the face of the overwhelming odds. Temperance looked each of her lieutenants in the eye, enforcing the need-to-know structure that had protected them for months. "If you are caught," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you know nothing. You were sleepwalking. You were confused. You do not know the routes. You do not know the safe houses. You protect the group by protecting your own ignorance." It was a cruel instruction, asking them to accept isolation and potential torture to save the collective, but they all nodded in understanding. The bond between them had transcended simple friendship. It was a pact of blood and silence that the whips of the overseers could not break. Despite the meticulous planning, the atmosphere in the hollow was charged with unspoken fear. A young man named Elias raised a trembling hand, his voice cracking, as he asked the question that haunted them all. What if the fog doesn't come? What if the moon is too bright? It was a valid concern. Their plan relied heavily on the meteorological patterns Temperance had observed over 18 months, but nature was rarely as predictable as a loom. Temperance stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then we move in the shadows of the buildings," she answered firmly. "We use the terrain we have memorized. The fog is a luxury, but darkness is a certainty. We have planned for the worst weather, Elias. Trust your feet." The details of the distraction that would facilitate their departure were also finalized. Silas reported that the bundles of oil-soaked rags had been positioned in the dry grass behind the barns of 3 different plantations, including Vance's. These were not meant to burn the houses down. That would invite a response that was too swift and too dangerous. But to create pillars of smoke that would draw the attention of the night riders. "We light them at 11:45, Silas grunted, his heavy arms crossed over his chest. "Just enough to get them running for water buckets, not enough to bring the whole county down on our heads." It was a calculated risk, playing with fire in a dry season, but the chaos was essential to cover the initial movement of such a large group. The logistics of the maritime route, the secret path for the most vulnerable, were confirmed by Moses. "The captain is ready," he said quietly. "He'll be waiting at the old dock near the mouth of the river. Low tide is at 12:30, so we have a narrow window to load the skiffs." This route was perhaps the most perilous, requiring a silent crossing of the river under the noses of the dock workers, but it offered the surest path to safety for the elderly and the infants. Temperance nodded, mentally placing the pieces on the board, visualizing the convergence of the land routes and the waterway into a single, unstoppable current of humanity. As the meeting concluded, Temperance distributed the final set of signals. She produced a handful of simple wooden spools, each wrapped with a single thread of blue yarn. "Leave these at the drop points as you pass," she instructed. "If I see the blue, I know the trail is open. If I see nothing, I know to send help or to divert." It was a primitive communication system, reliant on human messengers rather than telegraphs, but in a world where every written word was a potential piece of evidence, it was the only safe method. The spools were small and light, easily palmed, yet they carried the weight of life and death in their simple winding. The finality of the gathering settled over them like a shroud. There were no tears, no dramatic embraces, only a series of firm handshakes and steady gazes. They were leaving behind the only world they had ever known, walking into a wilderness that was as likely to kill them as the masters they were fleeing. But the alternative, remaining in bondage, waiting for the next sail, the next whipping, the next humiliation, was no longer an option. The desire for freedom had calcified into a weapon sharper than any knife Silas could forge, and it drove them forward into the unknown. Temperance watched them slip away into the night, melting back into the shadows of the quarters to catch a few hours of restless sleep before the dawn. She remained alone in the hollow for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the sleeping valley. The silence felt different now. Heavier, pregnant with the violence and victory that the coming days would bring. She thought of the chessboard in her mind, the white king sitting vulnerable in the center of the board. In less than 3 days, she would make the move that would sweep it away. The preparation was over. The pieces were set. The game was about to be played for keeps. The walk back to the big house was a solitary march, a transition from the general of a phantom army back to the invisible seamstress. As she crept into her small room, the first grey light of dawn was just touching the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. She lay down on her cot, fully clothed, her hand resting on the small bag of essentials she had packed weeks ago. There would be no sleep now, only the ticking of the clock and the slow, steady rhythm of her own breathing as she counted down the hours to midnight. The valley slept on, unaware that its history was about to be rewritten by the people it had chosen to ignore. September 10th, 1851, dawned with a deceptive tranquility, the sun burning off the coastal mist to reveal a sky of piercing, cloudless blue that mocked the turbulence churning within Temperance Carter's soul. She moved through the morning routines of the Vance household with an automaton's precision, stirring the cornmeal porridge and setting the table for the master's breakfast, her hands steady, only because she willed them to be. The big house felt like a stage set, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down, not just the minutes of the day, but the final hours of her existence as property. Every creak of the floorboards, Every rustle of the newspaper in Cornelius Vance's hands seemed amplified, as if the world was holding its breath before a great explosion. She served the coffee with her eyes cast downward, hiding the fire that burned behind them, watching the master obsess over a report of a distant land dispute, oblivious to the fact that his own empire was about to crumble within his walls. The tension in the slave quarters was a physical thing, a vibrating wire pulled taut between silence and screaming. Throughout the day, Temperance caught glimpses of her co-conspirators moving through their chores. The way Silas checked the forge with a lingering hand, the way Harriet folded the laundry with trembling fingers. And each shared look was a silent confirmation of the pact they had made. They were 54 souls holding their breath, waiting for the cover of darkness to test the fragile architecture of their plan. The normalcy of the day was a torment. The livestock needed feeding, the fields needed tending, and the household needed cleaning. Yet all these tasks were now performed by people who were mentally already miles away, ghosting through a world they were preparing to abandon. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, casting long, golden shadows across the vineyard, Temperance retreated to her room under the pretense of mending a torn curtain. There, in the dim light filtering through the small window, she changed into the clothes she had laid out weeks prior. Dark, rough spun trousers stolen from a scarecrow, and a thick wool shirt that would protect her against the night's chill. Over these, she wore her standard work dress, a layer of deception she would shed once she was clear of the buildings. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a hammer on an anvil, but her mind was a cool, clear pool of calculation. She checked the small satchel under her bed one last time, running her fingers over the smooth wooden spool that contained the blue thread, her promise to the others that the way was open. Dinner was a masquerade of obedience that tested every fiber of her acting ability. She stood in the dining room, a silent sentinel refilling glasses and clearing plates, while Vance and his wife discussed the upcoming social season and the possibility of purchasing a new carriage. They spoke of money and status, their voices a droning hum of arrogance, completely unaware that the woman serving them was orchestrating their financial ruin. Temperance noted the sweat on Vance's brow, the smug satisfaction in his laugh, and she felt a cold, sharp satisfaction in knowing that this was the last time she would ever pour his drink. The food tasted like ash in her mouth, or perhaps she simply didn't taste it at all, her senses entirely tuned to the ticking clock and the fading light outside the window. At 8 o'clock, the family retired to the parlor, and Temperance was dismissed to her quarters for the night, the standard routine that provided the structure for her departure. She did not go to her room immediately. Instead, she slipped into the shadowed hallway that led to the master's study, moving with a silence that was supernatural in its depth. The house was quiet, save for the distant murmur of voices from the parlor and the settling of the timber frame. Her objective was the heavy oak desk where Cornelius Vance conducted his business, a symbol of his authority and control. From the hidden pocket beneath her dress, she withdrew the checkmate message, the block of fabric with the storm at sea pattern, and the folded letter she had penned in the early hours of the morning. She placed the letter in the center of the desk blotter, weighing it down with a single, smooth river stone she had collected from the riverbank weeks ago. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial act, a signature on the invisible document of war she had declared. The letter contained a list of grievances, a declaration of independence, and a warning that the game was over. Leaving it there, in the heart of his power, felt like driving a stake into the heart of a vampire. It was the ultimate violation of his privacy, and the ultimate assertion of her agency. She paused for a moment, looking at the closed parlor doors, imagining the shock that would contort Vance's face in the morning when he found the empty quarters and the silent rebuke on his desk. Slipping out the back door of the kitchen just as the clock struck 9, Temperance merged with the shadows of the yard, becoming one with the darkness that had been her ally for so long. She made her way toward the barn, not with the hurried, frantic pace of a typical runaway, but with the steady, purposeful stride of a soldier marching to the front. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant tang of the sea, a sensory reminder of the freedom that waited beyond the valley. In her apron pocket, she carried the matches and the oil-soaked rags she had secreted away, the tools of chaos that would serve as the diversion for the greater good. The preparation for the fires was a delicate dance of timing and placement. She had identified 3 locations: a stack of dry hay near the barn, a pile of scrap lumber behind the smithy, and an old, disused storage shed on the edge of the property. At each spot, she arranged the rags to ensure a slow burn that would build into a blaze only after she was clear of the area. The goal was not destruction, but distraction. A series of fires that would pull the overseers and the family away from the slave quarters and toward the perceived emergency, creating a vacuum through which 54 people could slip like water through a sieve. As she struck the first match, the flare of the sulfur in the darkness was blinding, a tiny sun that illuminated her face for a brief second. She watched the flame catch the oil-soaked cloth, eating away at the fabric with a hungry, orange tongue. There was no turning back now. The moment the first spark caught, she had committed an act of open rebellion that carried a death sentence. She repeated the process at the other 2 locations, her movements swift and sure, her breath held tight in her chest to avoid making any sound that might carry on the still night air. By the time she finished, the smell of smoke was just beginning to taint the breeze, a ghost of the chaos to come. With the fuses of her diversion lit, Temperance retreated to the designated gathering point, a dense thicket of willows near the riverbank, where the shadows were thickest. There she found the others waiting, silent shapes emerging from the gloom like spirits being summoned to a reckoning. They moved without torches, without whispers, relying on the signals and memory they had drilled into themselves over months of preparation. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of fear and exhilaration that bound them together in a single, vibrating entity. Silas gave her a curt nod, his face barely visible in the darkness, confirming that the word had been passed, and the routes were clear. At the stroke of midnight, Temperance Carter stood at the edge of the Vance property, watching the first wisps of smoke rise against the star-strewn sky. Behind her, the vineyard and the big house slept on, unaware that the world had already changed. The fires were just smoldering embers now, but soon they would bloom into a beacon of their departure. She turned her back on the plantation and faced the dark, open mouth of the trail leading north toward the sea and toward the future. The waiting was over. The exodus had begun. The first sign that the carefully constructed world of the Sonoma Valley had been irrevocably broken came not from the discovery of the missing workers, but from the orange glow that bloomed against the night sky just after midnight. Cornelius Vance was roused from his sleep, not by the silence of the house, but by the frantic shouting of his overseer, Pike, and the acrid smell of smoke that had seeped into the very linens of the master bedroom. By the time Vance stumbled onto his porch, buckling his belt and shouting for order, the distraction was already doing its work. The haystack near the barn had erupted into a torch, lighting up the vineyard with a hellish light, while a second fire smouldered ominously near the smithy. The immediate panic was total, drawing every available white man toward the flames, with buckets and blankets, their attention fixed on saving the property, while the true theft occurred in the shadows behind them. It was not until the fires were beaten into smoldering embers and the adrenaline of the crisis began to ebb that the terrible silence of the plantation settled in. Vance stood in the soot-stained yard, his chest heaving from exertion, and turned to bark an order to the house servants for water, but the command died in his throat. There was no one there to answer. The kitchen was dark, the quarters beyond the garden were still, and the usual sounds of the night, the distant murmur of the enslaved community settling in for the night, were conspicuously, terrifyingly absent. A cold dread, unrelated to the cooling night air, began to creep up his spine as he marched toward the slave cabins, his lantern swinging wildly, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The discovery of the empty cabins was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance for the master class. They found rows of neatly made beds, swept floors, and an absence of personal effects so total it suggested the occupants had simply dissolved into the ether. There were no signs of a hasty flight, no dropped bundles, no scattered tools, no signs of forced entry at the gates. It was a clean, surgical removal of human capital that Vance could not reconcile with his image of the people he claimed to own. His roar of rage shattered the dawn quiet, a sound of pure impotence as he realized that his most trusted assets, including the seamstress who had mended his very coat the day before, were gone, leaving behind only empty air and the lingering scent of the smoke he had helped to stoke. The realization quickly spread beyond the Vance estate as the sun rose, revealing a valley-wide crime scene of unprecedented scale. Riders dispatched to neighboring ranches returned with ashen faces, reporting that the phenomenon was not isolated. The Hawthorne mine was a ghost town. The Miller dairy farm was silent, and the Hammond estate was missing its entire household staff. The scale of the coordinated disappearance paralyzed the white establishment, transforming the morning from a search for runaways into a panic of military proportions. It was a tactical strike, a phantom offensive that had been planned and executed right under the noses of men who believed themselves to be the apex predators of the region. Sheriff Alastair Crane arrived at the Vance estate by mid-morning, his demeanor betraying a rare loss of composure as he surveyed the scene and tried to coordinate a response. The legal and logistical nightmare was immediate. There were no trails to follow in the traditional sense. The ground was dry and hard, and the recent winds had scoured the landscape, or so it seemed to the frustrated trackers. The few prints that were found led in contradictory directions, some toward the river, some toward the coast, and some doubling back on themselves, leading Crane to suspect a deliberate attempt to create confusion. The silence of the land itself seemed to mock their efforts, a vast, indifferent witness to the mass exodus that refused to yield its secrets. The final crushing blow to Vance's ego was delivered in the study, where the letter and the quilt block were discovered by his wife, who had screamed and dropped her tea tray at the sight of the items. Vance burst into the room, his face a mask of fury, and snatched the paper from the desk, his eyes scanning the neat, feminine handwriting that he recognized with a jolt of horror. The letter did not beg. It accused. It listed the names of the vanished, the dates of their suffering, and the specific transactions that had severed families, turning Vance's own ledger of sins into a public indictment. The phrase, "the game is concluded," burned into his mind, a taunt from a woman he had dismissed as a mere domestic, now revealed as a mastermind of his humiliation. The quilt block, a storm-at-sea pattern, was a cryptic symbol that the illiterate trackers could not decipher, but which Vance understood instinctively as a flag of war. It was a piece of domesticity turned into a weapon, a testament to the hidden intelligence that had been weaving the conspiracy under the guise of women's work. He crumpled the fabric in his fist, his knuckles white, realizing that for 18 months the silent sewing he had observed had been the cartography of his defeat. The items on the desk were not just a goodbye. They were a calling card, a deliberate provocation designed to tell him that he had been outsmarted by the very people he considered incapable of strategic thought. By noon, the posse that had been hastily organized found itself paralyzed not by a lack of will, but by a lack of direction. The sheer number of escapees, 54 confirmed across the valley, meant that the standard tactics of pursuit were useless. There were too many potential trails and too few men to follow them all, especially with the local sheriff preoccupied with the political fallout of such a massive breach of the social order. The masters found themselves arguing amongst themselves about which direction to prioritize, their unity fractured by mutual recrimination and the paranoia that their own remaining servants might be complicit in the plot. The psychological impact of the letters distributed to other masters, as Temperance had planned, began to have a chilling effect on the pursuit. When Crane suggested offering a large reward for information, he was met with hesitation from several ranchers who feared the exposure of their own secrets detailed in the messages they had received. The threat of social ruin and legal prosecution contained in the texts made some men hesitant to draw the attention of the wider authorities or the press to the specific details of their labor practices. This hesitation bought crucial hours, allowing the trails to cool as the valley's elite debated the best way to manage the scandal without damaging their own reputations. As the afternoon wore on, the fires were extinguished, and the immediate chaos settled into a grim, festering realization. The old order was broken. Vance stood alone on his porch, the letter and the quilt block still clutched in his hand, staring out at the empty fields. The silence that he had once interpreted as peace was now heavy with a terrifying accusation. The docile workforce he had relied upon, had proven to be a phantom army, capable of a precision and discipline that his own class could not match. The hunters had become the hunted, haunted by the knowledge that they had been blind to the revolution happening in their own kitchens and quarters. The first day of the search ended in failure and frustration, with the posses returning empty-handed, their horses winded, and their tempers frayed. The Sonoma Valley had swallowed 54 people whole, and despite the money, the guns, and the dogs, the masters were left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. The legacy of the night would be a pervasive fear that spread through the slave-holding community like a fever. The fear that no lock, no patrol, and no whip could guarantee the safety of their peculiar institution. The game had indeed concluded, and the masters were left holding the empty board. While the masters tore through the valley in a futile rage, Temperance Carter did not immediately flee to the safety of the coast. Instead, she executed the most perilous phase of her plan by hiding in the plain sight of her enemies. She had calculated that the initial pursuit would be chaotic and broad, assuming the ringleaders would be the first to run, and she used that assumption against the hunters. Disguised in a layer of rough, stained clothing, and adopting the shuffling gait of an elderly washerwoman, she blended into the transient population that flooded the roads during the gold rush. She became just another face in the chaos, an invisible drifter moving against the current of the posses, her eyes and ears open to every rumor and accusation that drifted through the taverns and waystations. For 3 days, she moved like a phantom through the very search parties that sought her capture, hiding in barns and abandoned shacks during the hours of daylight, and walking the back trails by night. She overheard the frustrated curses of the trackers as they returned empty-handed from the river crossings, and she listened to the growing panic in the voices of the white landowners who realized their authority had been shattered. It was a dangerous game of psychological poker, requiring a nerve of steel to remain so close to the jaws of the beast. But Temperance knew that she was the central hub of the operation. She needed to ensure that the initial wave of fury had crested and broken without uncovering her people before she allowed herself the luxury of safety. Her network of communication, though fragmented by the exodus, still functioned through the pre-arranged signals she had established. She checked the designated hollow trees and loose fence posts for the blue threads that signaled success, finding them one by one as she moved southward. Each spool of yarn was a whisper of victory, confirming that a family had reached the coastal trails, or that a group had successfully boarded the captain's schooner. The relief was profound, yet it was tempered by the constant stress of her disguise. She avoided eye contact with white men, mumbled incoherently when questioned, and played the part of the simple, wandering vagrant with an Oscar-worthy conviction. By the 4th day, the intensity of the patrols began to wane, as the reality of the legal complexities set in. The impending statehood of California created a jurisdictional gray area that made the slaveholders hesitant to press their claims too aggressively in certain quarters, fearing the intervention of free state courts. Temperance sensed this shift in the wind and decided it was time to make her own break for freedom. She shed the disguise of the washerwoman and acquired a set of clothes more fitting for a free woman of means, using a small stash of gold dust she had retained from Silas's skimming operations. With her head held high and a forged pass in her pocket, she walked onto a southbound stagecoach as Mrs. Thompson, a widow traveling to San Francisco to reunite with her family. The journey to the city was a tense, rattling ride through a landscape that was transforming before her eyes. As the stagecoach rolled away from the vineyards and ranches of the Sonoma Valley, the scenery shifted to the bustling, chaotic outskirts of the burgeoning metropolis. Temperance watched the other passengers, a merchant, a miner, and a soldier, wondering if they could sense the secret she carried, the weight of the 54 souls she had guided out of bondage. She engaged in polite, superficial conversation, spinning a tale of a sick aunt that explained her travel, all while mentally mapping the streets of San Francisco she had memorized from the captain's descriptions. The fear of recognition was a constant itch between her shoulder blades, but the miles rolled on without incident, carrying her further from the scene of the crime. Arriving in San Francisco was like stepping into a different world, a chaotic symphony of noise, commerce, and human ambition that stood in stark contrast to the rigid silence of the plantation. The city was a sprawling canvas of tents and wooden buildings, rising haphazardly from the mud of the waterfront, teeming with people from every corner of the globe. Here, a black face was not automatically a sign of bondage. The population was too transient, too focused on the pursuit of gold to adhere strictly to the racial hierarchies of the South. Temperance stepped down from the stagecoach onto the wooden planks of the street, breathing in the salty air of the bay, and felt the heavy cloak of the last 18 months begin to slip from her shoulders. She made her way immediately to the quarter known as Little Ohio, a district near the docks where the free black community had established a foothold amidst the urban sprawl. It was here that the final pieces of her strategy would fall into place. She found the safe house operated by Brother Nathaniel's contact, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Hayes, who opened the door without hesitation at the coded knock. Inside, she found not just shelter, but news. The first groups of escapees had already begun to trickle into the city via the coastal routes and the riverboats, blending into the population and beginning their new lives as free people. The reunion with her lieutenants was a quiet, emotional affair, conducted in the back room of a chandlery that smelled of tar and rope. Silas arrived with news from the northern routes, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with the thrill of the successful journey. Harriet appeared a day later, having navigated the treacherous mountain passes with her group. They compared notes, piecing together the full picture of the exodus. There had been close calls, a patrol that had passed within yards of a hiding spot, a boat that had nearly capsized in the rough currents. But the plan had held. The network had functioned exactly as Temperance had designed, a machine of liberation that had hummed to life in the darkness and delivered its precious cargo to safety. Yet, amidst the triumph and the relief, there was a hollow space in Temperance's heart that the victory could not fill. She listened to the stories of families reunited and children seeing the ocean for the first time, but her mind drifted constantly to the rugged, distant north. The 54 were safe, but the one who had been the catalyst for it all, was still lost in the wilderness of the Trinity River mines, The checkmate she had delivered to Vance had been a powerful blow against the system, but the game was not truly won until she had retrieved her queen. The safety of San Francisco was not a destination. It was a base of operations for the next phase of the war. Temperance stood at the window of the small room, looking out over the bustling harbor, where ships from every nation anchored in the gray water. She was no longer a seamstress, no longer a conspirator in the shadows. She was a free woman, a strategist, and a mother on a mission. The documents in her pocket proclaimed her liberty, but her soul was already journeying northward, following the invisible thread that connected her to Clementine. She turned from the window, her expression hardening into the resolve that had carried her this far. The great escape was history, but the search for her daughter was just beginning. 2 years of silence and shadow passed before the thread connecting Temperance to her daughter finally pulled taut, leading her north to the rugged mining camps of the Trinity River. It was a journey that took her far from the relative safety of San Francisco, deep into a lawless interior where the gold rush had created a society built on sweat, violence, and the transient hope of sudden fortune. Temperance traveled under a new alias, a free widow seeking work as a cook, using her formidable skills to gain access to the rough boarding houses and taverns, where information flowed as freely as the whiskey. She was no longer the invisible seamstress of the Vance plantation. She was a relentless force of nature, driven by a maternal fury that no river or mountain range could deter. The search had been long and painful, fraught with dead ends and false hopes, but the network she had built, the very system used to free the 54, had finally produced a credible lead. The tip came through a circuitous route, a letter carried by a mule train from a man named Thomas, the forger who had created their freedom papers, who had since moved north. He had heard of a young girl in a mining settlement near Weaverville who matched Clementine's description, working in a boarding house run by a pragmatic widow. The girl, he wrote, was known for her cleverness with numbers and her quiet demeanor, traits that sparked a memory in those who knew the stories of the chess mistress. Temperance did not wait for confirmation. She packed her bag, settled her affairs in San Francisco, and boarded a coastal steamer to the northern port of Humboldt, beginning the arduous trek inland toward the place where her heart had been residing in absentia for 3 long years. Weaverville was a chaotic jumble of canvas tents and wooden shacks nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering, pine-covered mountains that seemed to press in on the inhabitants from all sides. The air was thin and cold, smelling of wood smoke and wet earth, a stark contrast to the damp fog of the coast. Temperance arrived in the late afternoon, her boots caked with the mud of the trail, her eyes scanning the bustling main street for the specific building Thomas had described, the Gilded Pick, a 2-story structure that loomed over the surrounding tents like a monument to temporary prosperity. She stood across the street for a long moment, her heart pounding a rhythm against her ribs that felt louder than the stamp of the ore crushers in the distance. This was the end of the line, the final square on the board. Entering the boarding house, she was immediately enveloped by the warmth of the hearth and the clamor of hungry miners. The dining room was a sea of flannel and denim, filled with the clatter of tin plates and the roar of conversation. Temperance approached the counter where a heavy-set woman, presumably the proprietor, was directing the servers with a booming voice. "I'm looking for work," Temperance said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her soul. "I hear you might need a cook." The woman looked her up and down, assessing the strong arms and the calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of labor. "Can you make biscuits that don't break a man's teeth?" the woman asked. "I surely can," Temperance replied, "and I can do it without burning the place down." As she was led toward the kitchen, the crowded room seemed to fade into a blur, her focus narrowing to the figures moving back and forth with trays of food. And then, as if the universe had finally decided to stop holding its breath, she saw her. Clementine, the girl, was taller now, her frame filling out the simple calico dress she wore, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She was carrying a heavy tray, with an ease that spoke of years of labor, her face set in a mask of concentration that Temperance recognized instantly. It was the same mask she had worn for 18 months on the Vance plantation. She was surviving, just as her mother had taught her. Temperance stopped in the middle of the aisle, causing a miner to grumble as he sidestepped her. The sound of the room seemed to drop away, replaced by a ringing silence. Clementine turned, perhaps sensing the sudden stillness, and her eyes met Temperance's across the smoky room. For a heartbeat, there was no recognition, only the polite, distant gaze of a servant assessing a stranger. Then, the tray in Clementine's hands wobbled, the porcelain cups rattling, as the reality of who stood before her broke through the wall of time and separation. The mask cracked, and the child Temperance had last seen screaming in a wagon was suddenly visible in the young woman's eyes. They did not run to each other. The danger of such a display in a room full of white men was too great. Instead, Clementine set the tray down on the nearest table with exaggerated care, her hands shaking, and walked toward the kitchen, giving Temperance a barely perceptible nod toward the back door. It was a silent communication that spoke volumes about the instincts Clementine had developed in the wilderness, instincts of caution and survival. Temperance followed, her legs moving on autopilot, pushing through the swinging door into the heat of the kitchen and out into the cool, shaded alley behind the building. The moment they were hidden from view, the fragile composure shattered. Clementine ran the last few steps, crashing into Temperance's arms with a force that drove the air from her lungs. They held each other in the shadow of the building, clinging to the physical reality of the moment, refusing to let go as if the world might try to tear them apart again. "Mama," Clementine whispered, the word a prayer and a sob. "I knew you would come. I told myself every night, I knew you would come." Temperance buried her face in her daughter's hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and soap, tears streaming down her face for the first time since the night of the escape. In the quiet of the alley, Clementine quickly explained the miracle that had preserved her. The man who had bought her, Gantry, had succumbed to a fever only 6 months after arriving in the north, leaving his property in a legal limbo. The widow who ran the boarding house, a woman named Mrs. Campbell, had taken Clementine in not out of charity, but out of necessity for labor. But she had treated her with a rough decency. When the local sheriff began enforcing stricter regulations on slaveholding in the state, Mrs. Campbell had allowed Clementine to work for wages, effectively freeing her by negligence. "I'm free, Mama," Clementine said, pulling back to look Temperance in the eye. I've been saving my money. I was going to come find you." The reunion was sweet, but Temperance knew they were not yet safe. The boarders inside would notice the absence of the help soon, and the presence of a strange black woman in a mining town could still raise dangerous questions. They agreed that Temperance would finish the shift she had promised, using the time to solidify their plan of departure. They would leave at dawn, heading south toward the coast and the steamer that would carry them back to San Francisco. There was no need for a complex chess move here. No need for fire and misdirection. Just a mother and a daughter walking away from a life of servitude into a future of their own making. As they walked back into the boarding house to finish their work, Temperance caught a glimpse of herself in a dusty mirror hanging by the door. She saw the lines on her face, the grey that had begun to streak her hair, and the hard-won strength that radiated from her eyes. She was no longer a pawn in a game of power, nor a queen sacrificing herself for a king. She was Temperance Carter, a free woman, and she had finally captured the only piece that mattered. The exodus of the 54 had been a triumph of strategy. But this, standing side by side with her daughter, was the only victory she had ever truly needed.